So I'm here today on short notice to speak about the Cambridge Metanet Society, what it is, what we do, what we plan to do. I'm Robin Kohze, mostly known as Rob GCC on Twitter, as Rob on the Metanet ICO page with Joel. I'm a PhD student in human genetics. I'm doing a lot of machine learning, I'm doing a lot of full stack work, so I'm just doing a bit of everything. So that's how I ended up in blockchain, and I understand a lot about complexity. That makes it really interesting for me to study blockchains, because as Joel said, it formalizes the world and that makes it measurable. So I shortly give an introduction how Cambridge life is, how the societies are. Afterwards, a bit about the Metanet, why I'm fascinated in it, why students will be too. Third, we will have two short applications, MetaVibe and BlockJournal. So they might not be the most finished applications yet, but they will show you an interesting use case that is not money, but using the blockchain, something that is beyond money, where you say people actually don't want to have more money in their lives, they want to have less money in their lives, they just want to do more with the money they have, with the resources they have. Cambridge students, they're probably studying 6-7 hours a day. Then they have psychologists where they eat food, they sleep. And then the rest of the time, that's probably 8-9 hours a day they spend in societies. And those societies, they come from sports societies to programming societies. And in those societies, they build what makes Cambridge so famous. And when we look at the internet as equivalent to what we see now in the blockchain space, then we see that we have a huge diversity of different applications, and those applications are mostly not created by companies that already existed. So you wouldn't see IBM here, you wouldn't see Xerox here, but you see projects done by graduates, postgraduates during the university time or in a university environment, because they don't care too much for the money at the moment. They care about, can we make something cool, something that nobody has ever done, and can we actually do it? So what do we have now on the Metanet? So we have applications that I would call payment providers. We have wallets, money button. We have data aggregators, everyone who just collects data. So that would probably be a weather SV, or maybe a Twitch is also a data aggregator in a way. Then we have social media application. We have games, just like the Metaland, I think it was called. Supply chains, the standard applications. But the question is, what's next? What do we really bring to life now that we have the Metanet and now that we can actually scale? And as a data scientist, geneticist, I'm always thinking about complexity. And what I learned from it is when you can formalize something, you can simplify it, you can add complexity on another layer to make it even better. So the idea of MetaVibe was, what if we could add a meta layer on top of the physical world, where we say every location we have in the world could be tagged with some kind of content that maybe enriches your peers' lives by just seeing it, saying, oh, I didn't know about that, or that's actually interesting. You put it on a blockchain to make it immutable, to let it stay there forever. And just like Twitch, you can then donate money for that information that you might have found interesting. You can also make content payable. You can then enrich people's life. You explore your environment, because there's actually something out there to explore, and you find information everywhere about maybe interesting occurrences at this place, or maybe interesting events that come up in the future. So that application we did for the BSV hackathon, the first one, and there we thought, what could be the minimal prototype for such an application? So we said we have maybe a Google map with all the interesting events happening in a certain place, all the information. And then you just wander around and explore your environment and see what's going on. We developed it with React Native, Planaria, Money Button, the standard candidates nowadays with unwriters too, that make it all happen. But as I said before, it's not about the application, it's more about the meta layer of such applications and what other applications there could be. The main idea of of MetaVibe was, what if we could have a dual competition? So on one side, the users compete for the best content. On the other side, and that we didn't have in the normal internet, providers compete for the best user experience by creating better and better apps. Imagine we had, instead of just one Facebook, a lot of competitors who all use the same data that you have now on Facebook, but they all try different ways to improve your user experience. And every user can just pick whatever applications they want to use to access the same information. And with this double competition, as I would call it now, you can have a way faster iterations through social media applications without, as a user, being too concerned about, okay, now I'm putting my data on a new platform and in a month it's gone and I don't even know what's happening with my data. So that's probably the main takeaway from that application, that why not create protocols that are stable and let everyone compete for the best. So then we said, let's transform journalism in a time of uncertainty. I presented it a few weeks ago at the Kohze conference, one of the biggest technology conferences here in London. And we said, what would it take to overcome the whole topic of what is fake news, what isn't, so who is actually giving the narrative, what is it and what is not. So we're living in uncertain times in so many ways because we cannot actually know. We just trust, and with blockchain we can make things rather trustless, but not in the way that we usually do it by cryptography, but rather creating a new protocol system that ensures that the information is correct and verifiable. So what do we need for it? We need to know who wrote this certain source, who was the observer. Then can we verify that what he said is actually true? Are there other people around? And third, there must be a reason why news publishers would jump on such a system in the first place. So we are not idealists. We are people who say, we make things so efficient that you cannot not use it anymore. And that's also what Craig's always mentions, that it's not about just creating money. We need something that is just outperforming it in every aspect. And that's what we are trying to do here. And I really hope the next slides are actually good. So how are news articles actually written? So what we saw so far is that you start with some ground sources. Maybe in this case, we take the example of a detonation in Syria. And the first thing you do is you probably interview people on the ground and they tell you something. Then the next reporter has an aggregation of those reports. Then a higher up news agencies takes maybe 10 different reporters' views on the incident and then aggregates again what they said. And then in the end, the news article might be a bit more balanced. It says those people have seen that, other people have seen something different. And then it also shifts between locations and say, in another area we had this other incident and is it comparable? So that's maybe a Merkle tree of news, one could call it. So you all know it who knows something about blockchains. Let's go to the next one, how it actually works. So here's an example of 2000, I think it was in 2012, so this is a page of 2018. So it was all about biological weapon detonation in Syria. And was it actually happening or was it not happening? So it's pretty difficult to know if you're not in the intelligence services. So how could we create a system that could even uncover such a problematic? Let's go to the next one. So after the detonation happened, then you ask the observers, so journalists run around, investigative journalists, what actually happens. And then there are certain groups, certain families who report what they have seen. But since news is not easy and the world is not easy, you will see what then ultimately happens. The colors represent the different observations people had. So just a few hundred meters next to them, people saw something completely different just because they were maybe not standing in the wind, so they couldn't even witness the chemicals or experience it. Other people were maybe from another grouping, another subgroup, and they said it's actually not that bad and we don't want to go into the whole situation, make it worse. So you see a lot of different opinions, and what can we now do with block journals to uncover such incidents? And I thought, What actually then happens is that different news outlets are taking different sources, write different stories. And how could we uncover it as a normal reader? Then we say, what if we can use licensing and blockchain transactions to actually ensure that you know which sources were used? Let's look at it from a perspective of the ground observer. He reports something, but nowadays he probably doesn't get anything. But what if he could post it on the blockchain? And the moment he did, he created immutable evidence that he posted that at that moment, at that location. So then the next thing is the newspaper are looking at what was posted in that area at that time. And in such a scenario, then the news outlets would pay a small license fee to use the information. So they make a payment on the blockchain. And as Joel said, making a payment is also a receipt that you did it. So once you have that graph of receipts, then you know how a news actually evolved, which were the ground source, what were the intermediates. And then we can, on one hand, maybe let's stay a bit there, say we read the news article, and they actually have to then give IDs of all the news sources, which might be transaction IDs they used, to provide evidence that they used, or they actually paid the license fees. At the same time, we as readers, we know which sources were used, and at the same time, we can meta-analyze the whole situation and say which newspaper used which sources and what were the outcomes of that reporting. And so as before, it's about the meta layer of what this application is. So this is all about making a system more efficient by having license fee payments on the blockchain. But we as third party, we gain so much from seeing those transactions. We're seeing where the sources are coming from. And if there's maybe a selective bias that certain outlets are using certain news, and can we make then a comparative analysis what is actually happening in that situation? And the last part was, if we have all this evidence, then we could create world maps where we say which news outlets used what at what time. Then we can scroll through time, see all the other incidents, what happened afterwards, what before. So we as normal users, we get a lot more transparency of what is actually going on in the world. But reality is often even more difficult. So when you have something like that in Syria, then those people will not do reports in English, right? So you have then a lot of translations, different translator interpret it differently. So you will create many micro ecosystems around it, and they all will all get paid for making a good job. And then you can also say certain sources, I can discredit him, so I can add a certain link, again via transaction to it, and then give all my evidence. And that way we can also, way after the paper was published, then 10 years later say, because of this source turned out to be non-credible, that we can retract all the articles that were written based on that source. And nowadays that's not really happening. So in Cambridge we have a lot of events. Last year we had all the top news outlets of Germany. So I'm German, so that made sense for me. And we discussed with him, how can we overcome the accusation of being fake news? And I said, what about just providing some sources sometime? Just like we do it in research. They said, no, it's impossible, it's so difficult, we have so much to do. So my argument then is, why not make them do it by paying the license fees? They get a simpler system, and as side effect, we get all the profits from it. So what's in it for newspaper, magazine journalists? First, they can prove that what they have written is based on some ground truth or some source. It's not completely made up. We have immutable evidence of that content. So what nowadays often happens, one guy writes a story, then it's slightly altered, then he gives another interview, same guy, but he tells something different, so nobody really knows. But with this formalization, we can be rather sure what was actually told and also how he changed his story over time, so we have more insights, more transparency. We can enable falsification. As I said, when we see that a guy was just making it up and he made up 3-4 stories and we got enough evidence against it, then we can backtrack all the transaction graphs, see which articles were based on that, and then getting more reliable news, also historically seen, that when we look back in 10 years, then we can give it another try and see what all the sources said, what was in the meantime uncovered and whatnot. Yeah. So what's in it for the creators? So when I'm sitting in the third world, then I might not even have a bank account, so how do I get money for what I'm posting? So it could be some really minor observation, but maybe you think, okay, maybe someone would be interested, why not? Let's put it there. Once the first guy pays your license fees, you made up for at least, yeah, probably 500 news stories that you could then pay with it. So as long as every 500 story you post is actually used by anyone, you make a good profit with it. So then the next thing is verify author's identity. Identity does not necessarily mean their full name. It can mean full name. And then we have more reputation system that we say if someone always reports in a high quality way and unbiased, then we give him a higher reputation. That's why we use them as news outlet. But in certain regions, you might have difficulties to put your full name onto something that you report. So then maybe some kind of pseudonymous ID might be enough, that you always post with the same ID. It might be some kind of blockchain ID. And since you're reusing that same ID, you're not known to the authorities. So in the end, Craig would argue the people make the government has any right, but we know they are tricky situations. So that way we can at least verify that the same guy is posting some valid information. Yeah, and the last thing is, when you now post something online, you will always find someone who just copies you, slightly changes the content, and then says it's mine. And then you have evidence that you were the first one who posted it. And you cannot do that on Ethereum or any other chain, because they would say, why don't you take the hash of the story and then put it on chain? And then I'm always arguing, but if we put everything on chain, then we could have search engines who directly prove that it is already there, instead of waiting for one author to come up with this original file and then making a case open for it. So it should be automatized, formalized, and that's more efficient in the end. So we said ultimately it's a formalized content library, because it might not only be text. The more we scale, the more media we can put on there. We could have videos, we could have images, all kinds of information. And since it's just an open protocol, everyone can add content to that open protocol. Then we have again this double competition. The web platforms compete to make the best content visible, and the user compete for the most accurate information. So events. What are we doing in the Cambridge Metanet Society? I guess that's mostly why I came to this show. Yeah, we have speakers events. I will announce one in a minute. We have hackathons from next year on. We will have tutorials. I think that's what I'm most keen on, because I think it gives back a bit the vibe of the time that Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak created their first computer, by just being in a community where everyone tried to just be a little bit better than everyone else. So not even the monetary motivation in the first place, just people who help each other, having a nice community. Especially when in Cambridge, you never know who you meet next. So many people are so incredibly smart, so I'm always happy to see someone like that joining the ecosystem. And meetups. So everyone else is also invited. So now the small announcement. So we will have a Cambridge Metanet event. A T is missing. So Craig, Steve, and Jimmy will be joining us the 17th of October. You guys are also invited, so we might be at some point a bit limited in the places depending on how many students we get, but we will put out a registration, and then we're happy to invite you to Cambridge. And so why are we doing it in October? Because all the new students arrive the 1st of October. Many MBAs, many masters that just do one single year, that already were in a certain job position, they're already experienced. They're just looking in Cambridge for that extra little bit more. that they can apply to their later life, to their management positions. So if we expose those people to the Metanet, the possibilities, also the simplification of certain creation processes, because now you need to take way less care of security systems because you just have a formalized systems where everyone can just use the same formula. I think then we could have a great success. Many small startups could be coming up if we do it right. And that's what I'm trying to do in the next few months. So we have a website up. So we will constantly expand the website. Now it's probably just the minimal versions. The more events we get, the more it will be extended. And at some point we might even have coding tutorials on there. We might have a learning platform, so already registered BSV camp. So we might have an interactive learning platform to bring what we learned into the world so that everyone can access it. We don't try to be too exclusive, we try to be inclusive, we try to bring everyone in who is interested. Also people not in Cambridge, we probably always have 10, 12 spots for every single meetup tutorial that we have. And hopefully I see some of you there again.